Hello, and welcome to Catholic Truths. Today we'll be discussing the differences between the Protestant worship service and the Mass. So, as a Catholic, one of the things I get commonly asked is what is the difference between a Catholic Mass and a Protestant worship service? First of all, we will focus on the Mass. In the Mass, we as Catholics believe that Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist, in the bread and the wine. That is one of our core fundamental views. So the Mass, instead of coming and listening to a preacher, the whole point of the Mass is a big build-up all the way up to the Eucharist, so we can not only be in communion with each other and the church, but with Christ himself. So, before I start discussing the Protestant worship service, I need to give some background on myself. I used to be a Protestant. I was a member of the Church of Christ, a non-denominational, very fundamentalist group. So most of my views come from that. However, they're very similar in what you see in the Baptist church, not all of them, but to most of them, and also many of your other churches, which are like your local community churches and stuff like that. So, as a reminder, the build-up for the Catholic Mass is the Eucharist. In a Protestant service, what most people go to do is learn. They want to hear a preacher speak from anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes, and any fundamental congregationalist right now would say that's pretty much true. We'll listen about that long, then people start coughing and trying to give them the sign that it's time to stop. So what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, when they actually have the communion, most of the time it doesn't take maybe 10 or maybe at most 15 minutes for them to go through the whole process, because for them they see it as symbolic, and more often than not you'll see them just simply passing it around. Some places even have pre-made packages of wine, or actually grape juice, and a little cracker in it. So the big aspect is listening to a preacher give a sermon. So there's nothing wrong with education. I'm always for education. Problem is that really the appropriate place for it during a worship service? Because when you're sitting there listening to someone actually preach, you're not at that point worshiping. You're just listening to someone talk about something you're very ignorant on most of the time. So you really have no idea if what they're saying is accurate or not. All you have is the scriptures they are using. He doesn't necessarily take the context of it. So a good example would be if a preacher wanted to discuss what's a good topic would be judgment. Okay, that's a good topic to discuss. So what does the preacher do? The preacher takes this topic and he'll find random Bible verses. And sometimes it's not random, but typically he'll just pick and choose which verses to use. And the most common one, judge not lest ye be judged. So, okay, that sounds like a good scripture. The problem is that scripture is not about judgment per se. It's about not being a hypocrite. So suddenly you're taking the scripture out of context and making it your own use instead of what it's supposed to mean. This unfortunately has fueled many agendas, and such manners we actually have very hostile churches. I won't mention them by name, but you can probably think of a few. We have very hostile belief systems, and it's all because you have a preacher that's able to take things out of context and make his own speech. And that's pretty much what it is a man up there giving a speech. And again, there's nothing wrong with learning, but it needs to be done appropriately and at the right time. So therein lies the big difference between what the Mass is and what a Protestant worship service is. Now, as a reminder, this was based on my own experience growing up in the Church of Christ and being around a lot of Baptist churches. I know if you were to go to an Anglican church, it would be very different. Same thing if you went to a Lutheran church. So your different denominations are going to have some very different views on these things, but for the vast majority of our Protestant denominations in the world, that's what it is, because that's just how mainstream Protestantism is. It's just come and listen to a man speak for about 30 or 45 minutes and maybe go to a class before that for about an hour. I've actually had discussions with priests before about, is it appropriate to learn during the Mass like this? And they said, no, it's all about a build-up to the Eucharist, and it should be about worship. However, they have agreed with me that a lot of Protestant churches are doing some things right with the Sunday school. And one thing that has been acknowledged is that we are seeing more and more Catholic churches have a Sunday school before or after the Mass. But if you notice, it's not during the Mass. So all regard should be that when you're at church worshiping, you should be doing just that. My point is, when you go to your church service, sit for the entirety of it and just think, am I worshiping? Is this worship? Just ask that of yourself. Look around and see what everyone's doing. Now, your view of worship may be different than mine. That's okay. But always ask yourself that. Also, another thing to ask you, and this is also a bit controversial, but am I here because it makes me feel good? Because one thing I've learned is if you're going to a church simply because you feel good when you go to that church, you're going to church for the wrong reasons, and it's probably not the proper church for you to go to, because you should always feel uncomfortable about what's being taught at church. I mean, not always, but there should always be topics that are uncomfortable for you, and it's because it's strictly to the Bible. And we got to remember Jesus said that the path is narrow. So if you don't see the path as narrow and you see it as a broad open spectrum for everybody, you're not following the Bible. Okay, so we're off on that rant. But anyways, that has been our video for today. Thank you for watching. I ask that you subscribe down below. Follow us on our Twitter account and go to our Amino, which is called Catholics. All the links are provided in the description below. Thank you, and God bless. There's gnats everywhere.